Hello and welcome to this session on Shakespeare in Context. My name's Anjna Chouhan and I'm from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon, where we care for Shakespeare's heritage in his hometown. So we'll be thinking in this session about the context in which Shakespeare wrote his plays, what kinds of things were influencing him, and in particular, what was the theatrical world like and how much influence did that have over what Shakespeare was writing. So we'll start off by thinking of Shakespeare in London. Shakespeare obviously left Stratford-upon-Avon because there weren't theatres there. In fact, the only way Shakespeare will have encountered theatre as a young man would have been through travelling players and travelling actors setting up in gardens or in taverns around towns like Stratford. So Shakespeare moved to London because this is a really exciting place to be. This is the capital city. All business happens here, the trade happens here, and of course the monarchs live here as well. Shakespeare was unique because he lived through the reign of two different monarchs, Queen Elizabeth I and King James of Scotland, who became King James I of England. So Shakespeare experienced these different political reigns. He experienced these different movements, different monarchs. And so his work is heavily influenced by that shift as well. And what's really important about London in this period is that the theatres were here. This is the first time in history that we have buildings designed for theatrical entertainments, purpose-built theatres. And there were two different kinds of theatres in London in the period. There were public theatres that were accessible to everybody, and private theatres which were much smaller, much more intimate affairs, and therefore much more expensive to attend. So they often attracted certain types of audience members, more wealthy audience members. And interestingly, we can in fact tell whether or not a play was written for a private space through the kinds of instructions that Shakespeare leaves his actors. So for instance, in the play The Tempest, the penultimate play that Shakespeare writes, we have lots of elaborate stage directions and various contraptions opening and closing and people appearing and disappearing on the stage. And all that suggests that it was written to be performed, first of all, in a private space, so somewhere where they could achieve all of these special effects much more easily, much more readily than in a great big public theatre. And the public theatres were interesting in themselves because they were different. They were large, open-air spaces where all kinds of people attended. You'd have pickpockets in the audience, you'd have prostitutes in the audience, and also wealthy members of society too, aristocrats, law students, lots of people attending the theatre. And public theatres were fascinating because of their structure. So if you look at this image, you'll notice that the stage is what we call a thrust stage. And that means basically that it thrust out into the audience and was designed to have audience members all around it, standing all around it, sitting on every angle, even behind the stage. So Shakespeare always had to make sure that his plays are directed at everybody all over the theatre. And this is why we end up with lots and lots of soliloquies in Shakespeare's plays, because this is the actor's opportunity to stand at the edge of the thrust and address audience members directly, the people standing under the actor's feet, sitting over the actor's head. This is interactive, dynamic theatre at its very, very best. So public theatres are really important for Shakespeare's work, and in fact they heavily influenced the way in which he wrote. And the reason for that is because in the period, audience members never really considered theatre as a visual experience. So nobody would say, I'm going to see Hamlet or I'm going to see A Midsummer Night's Dream. In fact, audience members referred to the theatre as an aural experience, so they'd always talk about going to hear a play or hear theatre. Now, this has important implications for Shakespeare and the way in which he's writing, because it means that emphasis is always on language, on dialogue, on conversation, on vocabulary, and the tone of what's being said. All the information that we need as an audience comes from the text itself. Now, there's a wonderful example of this in action in the very opening of the history play Henry V, which begins with a chorus who stands on the stage and addresses the audience directly. And the chorus asks the audience to imagine themselves in this giant wooden O. So the wooden O refers to the theatre. It was made of wood and it's shaped like a great big O. So he's addressing the audience members in this wooden O and saying, we're all in here, so we can't possibly recreate all the great big battle scenes in France. We can't possibly have thousands and thousands of actors portray the armies that were needed to perform this battle. Instead, we need you, the audience members, to use your imaginations. And in fact, Shakespeare uses the phrase imaginary forces. Let us on your imaginary forces work. So you have to help us out as the actors. You have to create these scenes in your imaginations. And in fact, when Shakespeare talks about horses, he says you, the audience, have to imagine them printing their feet into the proud earth. You have to do that because we can't do it for you. And in fact, something like the chorus appears in various other plays that Shakespeare writes as well. And a good place to think about that is the beginning of scenes. So if we look at the very opening scene of Hamlet, for instance, the first words that we hear are in fact a question. And the question is, who's there? Now that's important because it tells us that these characters can't see each other, which informs the audience that it's actually late at night, it's very, very dark. So this character said, who's there? 'Tis bitter cold, 'tis new struck 12, and I am sick at heart. So there's actually lots and lots of information that we're being told in this opening scene, in this opening exchange. It's really cold, it's midnight, it's really dark, and the characters aren't particularly happy about being where they are. Now in reality, this performance would have taken place at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So the sun was shining, or most likely it's raining and quite grey, but it certainly wasn't pitch black at midnight. So all this language, all this dialogue is designed to give you a sense of place and a sense of purpose. Why are these characters here and where are they? And similarly, in the second scene to Twelfth Night, we have the character of Viola, who again asks a question. What country, friends, is this? So she doesn't know where she is. That tells us a lot about her character already. And in fact, somebody responds, it is Illyria, lady. Now that's really important because Shakespeare doesn't have a great big sign across the back of the stage that says, welcome to Illyria. We need all of this information to help us understand where we are and why we're there. So that's really important. Now Shakespeare also has to worry not just about his audience, he also has to worry about his actors. Now you may have noticed, as you study Shakespeare's plays, there aren't lots and lots of great big elaborate stage directions. And the reason for that is that Shakespeare actually choreographs all of his directions into the texts themselves. And this is really, really well demonstrated in an extract that comes from Twelfth Night. A character of Maria is addressing 3 characters. She speaks to a gardener or a servant, and she speaks to Sir Andrew Aguecheek and Sir Toby Belch, whom she later marries in the play. So she's addressing these 3 characters, and she says to them, get you 3 into the box tree. So that's all instructions to the actor. Yes, it's in the text, but the actor knows where he's supposed to be standing and who he's talking to. He's talking to you 3 right next to him. So he's not looking at the floor, for instance. He's looking at the other characters. And then Maria refers to Malvolio, who's further off in the sun. So this is probably the middle of the day, probably early afternoon. And then she talks about being on this path. So the audience knows that they're supposed to be standing on a path. This is how we're helping us use our imaginations. She says, get into the box tree. So she's obviously pointing over to a box tree, to some kind of prop or perhaps imaginary structure behind them. And this all helps the actors, it helps the audience pinpoint what it is they're supposed to be doing. And when you look at your texts, see if you can find examples of Shakespeare leaving instructions to his actors, how he's choreographing their movements. How does he do that? And speaking of actors, Shakespeare had to worry about his actors, who he's writing his plays for. This was a constant worry for him. And luckily for us, we know exactly who was in Shakespeare's company. Thanks to the first folio, which was published in 1623, We have a list of all the actors with whom Shakespeare worked. First of all, in the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which later became the King's Men under the rule of James I. So we have a list of all of these actors, and Shakespeare knew exactly what actors he had in his company and exactly what skills they had as well. So he very often had to design roles for those actors and for their particular skills. So we're looking now at an image of an actor called Richard Burbage, who was a very great friend of Shakespeare's and a very, very great actor. He was in fact a leading tragedian of the time. And Richard Burbage was very, very famous, and audience members would flock to the theatre to watch him perform his next great role. And Shakespeare designed a lot of his characters around Burbage, around Burbage's skills. So, for instance, the character of Macbeth was written for him, so was Othello, so was King Lear, so was Hamlet. All of these characters were designed for this character. Malvolio too, comical characters as well. This is really important because it means that the skills Burbage had, he was very good, for instance, at delivering soliloquies. So all of those skills mean that Shakespeare knows how he can create, how he can craft this character for this actor. So the next image we're looking at is a picture of an actor called William Kemp. Now, William Kemp was a very famous comic, so he was a fool or a clown in the period, and Shakespeare knew that he was very, very good at coming onto the stage and doing lots of gambols and making lots of jokes and getting the audience laughing. And in fact, Will Kemp would often come onto the stage and ad-lib and start making up his own jokes. He was very, very good at that. And we do know that William Kemp had a horrible argument with Shakespeare and Burbage towards the late end of the 1590s. And he eventually left the Lord Chamberlain's Men and he decided to start a solo career. And one of the things that he did, which became very famous, he decided to Morris dance from London to Norwich in 9 days, and that became known as the 9 Days Wonder. So he was a very famous comical clown figure, and Shakespeare very often wrote roles particularly for him and for his skills. And finally, this image is very interesting. This is an image of the actor Nathan Field. Now, we know in this period that there were no women on the stage. Women were not allowed on the public stage. Perhaps in court and private theatres, it was more acceptable to hear a woman sing or to watch her act. But in the public theatre, it was absolutely forbidden for a woman to appear on the stage and begin acting. So men like Nathan Field would interpret those roles and become figures like Lady Macbeth, perhaps Rosalind in As You Like It, Helena and Hermia in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And in fact, we often imagine that the women's roles were played by young boys, prepubescent boys with wonderful singing voices. And that might be true of a character like Juliet, for instance, who is only 12 or 13 years of age. But for those mature women, for those grander female roles, those more perplexing ones, those more challenging ones, much older men would play them. Very beautiful, very admirable, aesthetically pleasing young men like Nathan Field, who were very, very popular in their day as well. So when we think about the context in which Shakespeare was writing, we shouldn't forget about the theatre. It's very important to remember the historical context, the sort of political, the religious context that Shakespeare was working in. But the theatre itself, the theatrical world, physically influenced what it was that Shakespeare was doing, how he was writing, and who he was writing for. Thank you very much for listening.